some were slightly older, slightly newer than the event in the battle, so they're kind of representational. For instance, one of the weapons which Punky mentions all the time is the use of hatchets in battle. So we have a hatchet, and it doesn't have a battle history, but you can see that at close range, it'd probably be pretty effective. This is a resin cast of a war club, less the blade. As you figure, we don't need the blade. This is going into the teaching collection at the museum, and kids being a little experimental, we really can't have them whacking each other with it.
Is a blade at that round end?
Have a pointed blade. There's actually a screw-in socket on this one. Okay, now, so the way I want to work on this is we're comparing sort of Plains Indian warfare with just post-Civil War U.S. Army warfare. Remember, the Civil War drew into service almost 750,000 men, both sides. It's an enormous undertaking. After the war, there were quite a few veterans that signed up again, and there are also younger men who didn't make it to the Civil War who volunteered. Now, a couple of basic things about the two armies here. The men in blue were professionals, no doubt about it, but also was a job for them. They had no real vested interest in the land. They were not defending their homeland. They were there to do a job they were paid to do. And they did it to an extent. It didn't work out too well because they were essentially out-arrowed. I can't say outgunned, but they're out-arrowed. The Plains people, Arapaho, Assiniboine, Sioux, normally fought on the basis of what's called county coup. That is, honor strikes. It wasn't necessarily a fatal kind of warfare. But when the other guy you're trying to count coup on has a gun, it tends to be pretty fatal pretty quickly. So the chiefs, particularly Red Cloud, developed their own system of what amounts to European warfare, really highly organized entrapment kind of warfare with hidden forces that would suddenly spring up. And his big control thing, and Punky gets this in the book, is getting the young men to stop dashing out for personal honor and giving away the location of where everybody else is in hiding, waiting to trap the men in blue. So there's quite a bit going there. Now I have kind of a PowerPoint. I want to move along a little bit. Trying to set some stage. I can take brief questions during this, but I've actually overloaded the program, as you can probably tell. All right, this is a famous painting cartoon from the 1840s. It's called Manifest Destiny. And from the time that Europeans began to settle the continent, especially by about the time of the American Revolution, there was an ongoing belief and assumption that it needed to be coast to coast, that European settlement needed to be from East Coast to West Coast. The British and the French were actually much further ahead on that, going through Canada. But the British colonies, British colonies and the Spanish empires did their part too. But there was this idea that the people in the way were in the way, and that it was manifest destiny to go forward with it. So manifest destiny is kind of a loose term. You find it bandied about in history books quite a bit. Now, before the Fetterman battle, most of the Plains tribes were in these locations, several hundred to 1,000 miles to the east. The Sioux people are actually from Minnesota and east of that. But as westward pressure was mounting before, during, and after the Civil War, during the Civil War, but after, they were pushed further and further into the plains, and they began to displace Shoshone. I gotta find where my little magical pointer went here, folks. There we go. Okay, so you can see the modern political borders. And so they're moving, these people are moving in on other people which are having to move further west. The Paiute people that are in Nevada now were not always in Nevada, they were pushed there. The meat eater, or the sheep eater Indians in what we call Yellowstone Park, were people that lived year round in that harsh climate. One of the tragedies of the fires of 1989 is it burned down the remaining meat eater shelters, or what did I just say there? What did I just call them? I'm tired tonight. Anyway, there's some of the relics were burned down during that. I'll come back to that. So think of the moving west. I'm not gonna go entirely on a chronological order. I'm gonna take bits and pieces, and in front of you, you have a whole lot of paper. I'm gonna use, from the basis of this illustration, I'd like you to find in your pile of paper this first piece that I'm using. It's entitled 600 Years of Firearms Development. Can you pull this out? It looks like dry numbers. How many of you have military service here? How many are know quite a bit about guns and arms? Okay, I'm pretty sure it's a pretty knowledgeable audience. We developed this when Richard Galley and Richard was a co-curator with me on Weapons that Won the West. That was in the year 2000, 2001. What we did is we used weaponry as a metaphor for 12,000 years of change out here in these mountains. It's a technology that changed from essentially Stone Age to nuclear weapons. And we had atlatls, and we also had the third stage of the Minuteman missile, so we kind of covered the gamut in that one. So go quickly here. On the left column is the era, like 1400 to 1550, which is a long era. You had matchlocks and wheel locks, which essentially were handheld cannons. They were ignited with a glowing match or glowing piece of rope. So it would take rate of fire, which is pretty optimistic on this, that you could load the thing, prime it, blow on your match, fire it, and 25 yards. Well, in here, 25 yards is not that much more than just the depth of this room. The accuracy is poor and it's expensive. And its effect on humans and wildlife, that last column, is pretty critical to our discussion. Minimal bows and crossbows were the main weapons of this era, as well as pikes and lances. So the era that we have conflicting in our battle in 1866 is we have people that are still in the bow and arrow stage of technological development, but they're up against people that are using manufactured weapons, which you see down below. So then the flintlock, which we have some here, pervades in the world and is a trade item. There are several replicas on the table. And when a weapon comes in to anybody, soon everybody has it. You can't keep down technology. It's going to spread, it's going to be captured, it's going to be traded for, it's going to be bartered. So again, now you're a shot a minute. By 1770, you're a shot per minute at 150 yards, and the accuracy is good, and the cost is cheap. As weapons develop, they actually become cheaper and cheaper per shot. Significant warfare becomes more deadly, and hunting requires less skill. So 1830, you get a really critical change, the percussion lock. And I happen to have a little rattly tin here of percussion caps. A Scots preacher who was a bird hunter tried to hunt birds in Scotland, it was a pretty wet climate, with a flintlock shotgun. Wasn't very successful because usually the gun would misfire, not fire at all. But he was also a beginning of a scientist, so he found that you could take fulminate of mercury, which when you strike it, it explodes with a pretty hot flame. And he developed the percussion lock and the percussion cap. Now the cap, well, a flintlock, I'd say you're doing pretty well to get a shot 7 out of 10 times. But with a percussion cap, it's going to be closer to 9, almost 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. It's very reliable. So this changes weapons because we now have reliable ignition, but they still are slow to load. The Civil War comes along, and we begin to really get serious about metallic cartridges. And so by 1850, and we're beginning to get cartridges which are the bullet, the powder, and the percussion cap all in one unit that can be shoved into a precise fitting chamber. That's a rapid rate of fire. With percussion, you can get 1 shot per minute, 200 yards. Reliability is good, action is good, cost is cheap, very significant. Armies were modernized, casualty and kill rates greatly increased. 1850, metallic, 1 shot per 2 seconds. 1860, repeating rifles, which we have here, and handguns, 6 shots plus, and ranges of 500 yards. 1840 and up to modern, we begin to get really high rates of fire with automatic weapons, all using cartridges. And now radiant energy, so-called ray guns, there are anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems that use focused lasers. That's one reason why the North Koreans are of great interest, because they're trying to develop hypersonic missiles and steerable missiles that may be able to outwit anti-missile systems, even so-called thermal radiation systems. So this thing you can copy or and criticize and have fun with. We use it quite a bit just to get kind of to skip the settings. So here on the screen, I am getting old tonight. What did I do with my laser pointer?
It's over there in your book.
What will come from that? Okay, quite the melee. You see it's handheld, sort of handheld warfare. Now, put a little bit of time perspective on it. When Spanish left off horses in the New World really changed. And Spanish horses reached this area, we think about 1715, but also firearms reached this region. Also metal traps reached it. The fur trade and fur trading companies, Hudson's Bay and so forth, really spread technical culture very quickly. So here what we have again, these are just replicas we use for teaching at the museum, but they're sort of symbolic. When you have a steel or an iron point, it doesn't shatter when you hit it with something. It's sharpenable. It's recoverable. We have now, instead of a stone tip, beautiful piece of work, and very deadly, but also very fragile. Probably once it's launched, if it hits any target, it's probably going to shatter the tip.
Rock or anything.
Say again?
A rock or anything. Yeah.
Rock or a rib.
Yep.
Imagine killing a bison, trying to ride up really close with a powerful bow and fire an arrow through. Well, once the horse got there, bison could be run down instead of being run over cliffs. So bison, and I'm going to put a little side thing in here, what happened to women in all this, is before the horse, occasionally somebody would get a bison or they'd run some over a cliff and women were stuck with flushing hides and jerking the meat. But when guns and horses came along, the bison kill rate went way up. The fur trading companies wanted bison hides for a variety of reasons, and women's work massively increased in preparing all these hides for the trade. Very difficult for them. There's quite a bit of commentary especially in Crow tradition about the amount of work of all these hides. One other thing about bison hide, toss this in. We hear the usual stuff about starvation politics, yeah, that was part of it. And supposedly hunting for tongues and hump meat, yeah, probably. And maybe for robes to keep warm. You know what the real reason why so many bison hides were taken, what the market was? Leather.
Leather belts.
It's the best leather there is. I have a set of bison shoes I bought from Schnee's 40 years ago. And I've worn out 4 sets of soles on those. I can't even begin the tops are not even cracked yet, and I wear them in all kinds of sloppy weather. When industry was developing in Europe and in New England, you had steam engines or water power producing a very large amount of torque, but you have to get that down to the machine, to the loom or to the hammer down below, so you need a flat belt to do it. So bison belting was the durable belt that could bring the power from the overhead line shaft down to the machine. Finally, about 1870, we began to get vulcanized rubber reinforced with cotton, and then bison hide was no longer so much needed. But it's just a little bit of a side thing. The technological overwhelming of the Indian people is really something to behold. All right, now this picture's going to come back to you sometime. And quick, why were bugles so important in armed combat for European style armies?
Communication.
Yeah, that's how you signal. The bugle call tells you which way to move, whether to go forward or go to retreat. There, you had to, as a trainee, you had to learn the bugle calls. They're pretty important. The bugle can be heard a long ways. It's kind of an early communication. Something I couldn't find a slide on is also the heliograph. These are sort of Morse code mirror systems. But something that Punk really gets right in the book is the Indians use mirrors to signal quite a bit. We don't usually hear about that. The movies don't reinforce that very much. Movies are not a good source of history, but they're fun. But yes, people using little fragments of mirror. Notice in Punky's book, there's no mention of smoke signals or any of the stereotype cliche stuff. His people were as technologically advanced as they possibly could be. And one thing that Red Cloud did and his fellow chiefs is they studied the army that was up against them. They studied it. They found out what the moves were. They found out what the ranges were. They quickly found out what the range was of the mountain howitzer and knew how to stay out of range of it.
So why did they respect the bugle?
Well, the bugle, one of the things in battle, one of the things you try to kill first is the bugler, because then you just disrupt the communication. Now, one of the few surviving artifacts from the Fetterman you're going to see in a little while here. Guess what it is?
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Okay. This is the top historical artifact in Wyoming. The bugle was recovered from the battle site and cleaned up a bit. As a museum person, I really prefer that they hadn't cleaned it, just left it as it was. But it is what it is. But this is pretty symbolic. After in the destruction at the end of the fight, everything was trampled and the bugle was left behind. So we're gonna come back to this several times. Oops. All right. This is Grumman's sword, allegedly. I have my doubts about it. Let me show you why. I was able to borrow an enlisted saber. This is made in 1862, Civil War era. These look like they're probably fairly effective weapons, but when it really gets down to it, this was the most likely weapon that was used against the soldiers. Probably put them as clubs of various forms. This thing weighs a couple pounds, and suppose that you're on horseback traveling at high velocity, and you whack somebody with forward motion, they're going to stay pretty well whacked on it. So
Yeah.
this is a resin cast that we requested, and because I couldn't find an authentic one. But to handle a sword and also to have a sword survive and be identifiable, supposedly this has a pretty good history, that it showed up at an auction and all that. It may be another artifact from the fight, but it also may not be. But again, we're just trying to touch history here a little bit tonight. Okay, now these are ledger book drawings, and this has some pretty symbolic meaning. You notice an organized army, and you see somebody trying to count coup. That is, you gain, in Indian society, you gain status and points for your courage of attacking the enemy, and either touching or possibly even killing him. But it's single person combat, and young men get their reputations by counting coup. All kinds of records are kept of who's done what to whom. But it also is not a good tactic against guns. So when your opponent has a successful tactic, you probably want to imitate that tactic. And while we're going backwards here, folks, let's try it this way. Any ideas why this thing's running backwards? They reversed it somehow. It's got a laser pointer in there too, I see. That's what I thought it was, okay. This is a ledger drawing of a mounted Cheyenne warrior counting coup with lance on a dismounted Crow warrior. Okay, there's various levels. Wounded in combat, you can read them down there, and there's different kinds of honor that you achieve. And then the feathers that you wear, if the way they are trimmed also indicates what you've done. These are badges of honor cut different ways. Well, unfortunately, the kind of warfare that people got engaged in at the Fetterman is not an honorable kind of, it's out and out warfare. Come on. Okay, now we'll get into the weapons a little bit here. So, can you hear me without the microphone, okay?
Yeah.
And then that's a cripple with it. Let's work with the Indian's weapon. We tend to think of a bow as just a bent stick. The people who made short bows that could be used to fire an arrow through the ribcage of a bison and kill it. It's quite a strong bow. Many of the bows they made were laminated, actually laminated hide on the back or laminated even sections of horn. Make the bows very stiff. Probably any of us would be really challenged to be able to draw a short bow. The bow had tremendous power. It also had a range of about 50 yards. The arrow would have an effective range of about 50 yards. But when you consider how many arrows that a knowledgeable archer can get in a minute, the estimates, and I have really trouble with this, but I kept coming across it. The estimates after the battle of the number of arrows loosed in the Fetterman is 40,000 arrows. Apparently there are accounts that the ground is simply covered. Also, when an arrow is launched and it's on the ground, well, pick it up and use it again. There's quite a bit of repeat. Now, when somebody fires a cartridge, that's the end. The cartridge is spent. It has no further use. But keep in mind that the bow is a very effective weapon, and I hope I can get to this thing I really want to get to here.
They aim at the computer. With the bow and arrow.
Yeah, on this black thing over here.
Still I'm using it down. Okay, so now we have a percussion lock. That's what I wanted to get back to. So, those of you that read the book, what group in Fort Phil Kearny had the repeating rifles? Who had the Spencer rifles? 7 shots. The band. The band was probably the best armed band in history. But the band had uniforms. They wanted to have uniform weapons. They had about 30 Spencer rifles, which are a good repeating rifle. So the band got the rifles instead of getting the muskets. The people going out on the wood train or defending the wood train every day, or the hay cutters, were equipped with a little more than a club. Here you have a percussion musket. It's rifled. It has quite a range, and it's a very powerful weapon, no doubt about that. But when people look over my shoulder when I'm working on a computer, I get rattled and shaky and don't do very well. Can you imagine being in the stress of combat and trying to load powder, and paper, and a ball, and ram it, and put the rammer back in the socket maybe, not fire it out of the gun. And while you're getting all that done, then you get to go back here and cock it and put a priming cap on it, and then you get to aim, then you get to fire, and that's probably a minute. In the meantime, you've been killed. So, this is not a proper, you have the idea. I had to borrow a bayonet that doesn't quite fit the musket. But when you've spent your one shot, then it gets to be hand-to-hand combat very fast. Now what's happened here is old thinking. Old thinking is kind of a curse that happens to all of us. It's pretty famous in the military. At the time of the Revolutionary War, you'd have 2 or 3 ranks of men. The first row would fire, and then the second row would step forward while the first row stepped back to reload. So you did get a series, a fairly continuous heavy fire that way. It could even be 3 ranks of loading, firing, loading, firing. But when you're out in a wild swirl of individual warriors, it's not going to be very effective. And also the gun is pretty clumsy. At the Fetterman, you had 2 kinds of mounted soldiers. You had mounted cavalry, but you also had mounted infantry. And the infantry was generally made up out of inexperienced recruits. So they had to, can you imagine managing a horse that's probably frightened by gunfire as it is, being in a battle in rough terrain, and trying to deal with a weapon like this. But these were just not meant for mobile warfare, but that's what they were. Now, we've got to do a little bit about thinking. Abraham Lincoln approved the manufacture of the Spencer rifle, which is a 7-shot repeating rifle. But the Army was opposed to it, and Lincoln gave an order for 30,000 to be manufactured, and the Army ignored the order. And what the Army's thinking was, I'll try this out, is if men had repeating rifles, they'd waste ammunition. So if you give them a gun that doesn't fire very much, you don't have to make as much ammunition. But there's also a more manufacturing kind of based thing. It's important here to build an ammunition factory. It's probably quite a huge undertaking to build the factory and the machine work and the chemical industry that has to go to make gunpowder. That's a big job. So they probably felt if they had repeating rifles, they'd actually exceed their ammunition supply and not be able to be resupplied. So it's not as irrational as it seems. Punk does deal with that too. Now let's go to the repeating rifle that right after the Fetterman, virtually every cavalry soldier had a repeater or a breech loader. So this is a Spencer rifle. I had to go to some trouble to borrow this. There are not that many around anymore. It became pretty much the standard rifle after the Civil War during the Indian Wars. First of all, how you load it. Okay, this has a spring in it. Drop in 7, hopefully you make the point forward. Doesn't work well if you drop one in backwards. And then you push, the spring compresses. Okay, operate the action. You have to half cock it first. This isn't as fully automatic as a Winchester is. So now we bring a cartridge forward, chamber, finish cocking, aim fire. Okay, so the hammer is down at that point. So you then have to pull it. I notice I give you a list of videos. By the way, you can go online and have a great time looking at people firing these old weapons. You have a whole list of stuff there. It's all on YouTube, which is pretty easy to access without even joining. So what I see on there is pulling the full cock and cycling and shooting. It just means you have a live gun a little sooner than you expect. Half cock, the gun's not really live. Full cock, yikes. And the cartridge was 50 caliber.
Pretty good size.
We're trying to follow basic gun rules here, not pointing guns at people. Remember the happened on that set a couple months ago?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As my father taught me, all guns are always loaded. Absolutely right on that. So the
Tell me the difference between cavalry and infantry.
infantry is usually guys walking along on foot. The infantry is pretty much your ground army, the army that takes land and holds it. It does really the grunt work. It digs the trenches, builds the bridges, fights the enemy, dies in mass. Probably the poorest food. Cavalry is probably horse-mounted, or now motorized, and much more mobile, probably better equipped, probably better educated, and better paid. So that's kind of general. Now, let's do something really cool here. This is not a pipe organ the way I'm sitting here. So, you're under fire with your Spencer, and you're getting kind of shaky, and can you imagine, even with a gun like this, fumbling around in your pouch, on your belt, and finding a cartridge and getting it nose down, and people are shooting at you, or you're on horseback, and the horse is probably rather upset. So, here we have a Blakesley loader. Just a tube with all the cartridges nicely inside, with a paper tab over the end. So you rip the paper off, pour your cartridges in. Put in the spring, and you load it. Apparently it's possible to shoot 40 rounds per minute if you're really practiced with the Blakesley loader. Now the guy, Hayes Autopollack, is one of the major collectors in the country, and he loaned me this Spencer, but he volunteered that we could have this very rare antique. I doubt you'll ever see one again. They do sort of appear on the market, but one like this, which is in new condition, it also shows the way that firepower goes up. Of course, death and blood letting go up too. Well, isn't all that exciting? And then your swords, and then your revolvers and pistols. Now, this is Indian stuff down at this end of the table here. Very shortly after flintlocks got into the West, or into the Midwest, guess what? There's kind of a racist thing that goes on that Indians are too ignorant to be able to figure out how to shoot a weapon. It's something that Punk does very well in the book about capturing. One scene, they capture a revolver, and they figure out in short order how to load it and prime it. Okay? It's really not smart to underestimate your enemy. And loading a muzzle loading revolver is a long, slow process. It takes forever. I shoot some black powder. The fastest I've ever been able to load 6 was 6 minutes. I couldn't imagine doing that under fire. This is a shootable copy. These are a couple $100 used, but it's a replica of a Remington. And Indians had plenty of capture stuff. They had trade guns, trade percussion guns, trade flint guns. They had buffalo rifles, which were, here's a percussion version of the rifle. Sometimes they made what are called Indian runners. Anybody know what an Indian runner is? It's essentially a sawed-off gun. Can you imagine riding along on a horse, trying to maneuver and get a rib shot? A bison that's running along beside you, probably changing lanes pretty quickly. Well, suppose you cut the stock off, suppose you cut the barrel off, then you have a really high-powered pistol that you can manage a lot more easily from horseback. It's called a buffalo runner. They sometimes show up in antique shows. They're fairly easy to fake.
Well, they're sawed off.
They're sawed off. And pretty interesting, the barrel that was sawed off wasn't just thrown away. It was cut in a couple pieces and given to the Indian and hammered Indian women and handed over and used as hide scrapers. A steel scraper works a lot better than a horn scraper on flesh and hide. So I don't know what happened to the end of the stock. That's probably another story. I was not able to find a Colt 44 revolver. Here's a replica. Here's this monstrosity. I just thought you'd get a kick out of seeing this. This is a version of the first widely manufactured Colt revolver. These were about 1,000 were made during the Mexican War in 1840. So this is huge hog leg. And how many of you have seen True Grit?
Yeah.
Remember when Addie fires one of these things, he takes a big bead, bang, and it knocks her down? Well, it takes a rifle load, it takes 60 grains of powder. And even though it weighs about 6 pounds, I brought it in because its lines and proportions are like a smaller Colt. It's just this huge hand cannon here. But also it happens to have a capping tool, because when you load one of these, you have to cap each cylinder. And this issues your cap so you can push it on. Powder flask, bullet mold in case you need to make a few more. Effective weapons don't have to be very expensive. This is just a hardware store hatchet, and Punk refers constantly to hatchet attacks. Doesn't call them tomahawks, hatchets. And something like this at close range would be pretty devastating. And then he refers to war gloves. So now I think we've gone through the blood and gore for a while. Let's get back to politics.
Excuse me, can you talk about that war club? What would an original be made of?
It'd be a stick with a rock, or a rock. This is one of our handleable pieces. Nobody cares if it's a piece of resin.
I lifted it already, that's very good.
Yeah, it's proportionately heavy, I think. Anybody else need a good club in here? So there you have a musket and a musketoon. Help. Push it down. Not getting any result. Ah, just let me go. Why don't you just sit there and I'll just sit there and call for a slide. Just like a typical incompetent professor, can't run his own AD. My students just have the best time when I'm in a classroom. They completely fall apart. All right, so when you visit the memorials and this monument at the Fetterman, they have displays of the typical weapons that were used at the Fetterman. Now on the bottom there, you see something kind of unique. There is a repeating rifle there. Now you were aware there were 2 civilians killed at that fight? Those who've read the book know there were 2 killed. There were 2 civilian, I can't remember what their function was, whether they're traders or not, but they both owned Henry repeating rifles. And Henry rifles were manufactured during the Civil War, And wealthy officers oftentimes bought them, or the families bought them for them, but they were not issued. So here you have 50 shots. Load, fire, load, fire. It ejects and reloads all in the same swing. It's a much faster weapon than the Spencer, but it's not as powerful a weapon. When you see a later Winchester, this is the most expensive rare rifle in the room here. This is in 1866. Winchester bought Henry out, and they decided to load them from the rear. There's a side gate here, but watch how this thing was loaded. Speaking of being under pressure. Okay. What do you see right here on this barrel? It's got a crack.
Yeah.
Oh, weird. Okay, so here we have, all the cartridges are gonna be in this tube. There's a spring that's gonna push them down. So, we push that spring all the way up. Try to get it to lock, folks, there. And the barrel turns.
Oh.
How about that?
Oh.
So that uncovers the load. So 15 in, drop, 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 drop. Close it. And every time you fire, the spring moves the cartridge down. Now, you could make a bad mistake and just let this drop and actually have a cartridge discharge. Now, the thing is, sounds well and good, but can you imagine under pressure dealing with something this complicated and reloading it after you used your 15? And that was probably what the two men who were killed were found surrounded by a pile of empty casings. I'm guessing, this is just my guess, that one would load while one was beating off Indians. But still, it's a challenge again when you're totally shaky and frightened. And there's one thing that Punky does very well. He mentions how foggy and smoky the battlefield is. It's a fairly still, cold day. And that was also something in the Civil War. The first volley, and the whole battlefield disappears in a white haze. And if there isn't air movement, it's very difficult to tell what you're doing. So you get this thing loaded, and it was a 4440 cartridge, about like a modern 38 power. So it'd be tough to do, and there isn't any kind of a quick loader like the Spencer had. And also these were pretty fragile. Their mechanisms were notoriously weak, easy to break or jam. But it was one of the first of the multiple shot weapons that evolved into the Winchester. Well, I'm just gonna do my movie trip right now while we're here. All of us watch Western movies, I assume. So this thing is an 1892 Winchester. This one was made, okay, to the civilian, to most people's eye, a Winchester is a Winchester. No big deal. Well, this is an 1892 Winchester. It uses a cartridge which is totally straight. And it doesn't matter what size blank you put in these, so these are ideal for movies. You just, if the blank will fit into the barrel, you can fire it. So these, whenever you see a movie and it's gonna be, you'll see Civil War, you'll see Civil War movies with people firing Winchesters and cartridge firing revolvers. So this is dummied up. You sometimes see them dummied as a Henry where they paint the receiver. They'll paint the receiver brass. You can make a Winchester look like a Henry, except when you look closely, it has the side loading gate. See where my finger is here? That's the giveaway. But then, who cares? It's just a, but if you're being authentic, so most every movie gun is an 1892 blank firing gun. And they were, over 1 million were made. And I'm thinking probably half that number survived. They're very common. They came in calibers big enough to kill deer. Whew, all this talk about guns, my God. Now help me find, I need a slide. Okay, recent work on the battlefield, we covered the Banane Ball. This is a slug that's sort of hollow in the base. That's a French invention. It travels very accurately. And round balls were not fired at each other during the fairness. Probably slugs of some kind. So I'm gonna do a slide. here's the musket that we held up. You see how complex it is, what kind of club it is. All right, now there's the dispenser. And that's a remarkable piece of geometry in that action which loads down there. And dispensers were standardized at 5650. That refers to, the 50 is the diameter of the bore, and the 56 is the powder weight that's in the cartridge. The Army rapidly began to standardize after the war. So here we have a Sharps, which is very common after the war. It's converted from being a paper cartridge gun to a metal gun. Quick to load, quick to shoot. So breech loaders came in, repeating rifles not so much, not yet. And while we're stopped, here's something that you will not see anywhere else. This is a split breech Remington. How many have read the recent biography on Nelson Story? Story drove the first large herd of cattle from Texas to Montana. And he armed his cowboys. He bought 25 breech loading or split breech Remingtons. They were brand new. He actually outgunned the Army. He drove these cattle through military reservations, eating military grass. They were not pleased about it. He got to Fort Phil Kearny, and there was a big row there, almost a shooting fight between the poorly armed U.S. Army and the well-armed cowboys. So this is a breech loading gun. Notice it's short, handy length. It's also the same caliber as the Spencer and the Sharps. So this one, the breech pulls back, cartridge in, breech closed, and fire. The later Remingtons had even a stronger breech, but these were designed for easy handling, and so in effect, Story outgunned the Army. When we did the arms show at the museum, and Richard Galley and I did that show all those years ago, we had trouble finding a split breech. It took us almost a year to find one we could borrow for a year for that show. But this is a rarity. They're tellable by, because you can see that there's almost like this, looks like sort of like two hammers back here. And that's actually supporting the cartridge when it fires. These were manufactured for the Civil War, but they never made it. The war was over. So most of them were sold to France. And it's very rare that the ones you find in the country are kind of unusual. Let's go back a little bit. Now, here we have, you can see the mechanism of the Spencer rifle. You see the cartridge coming up through the stock. And then it's in an elevator, it's lifted, pushed forward, fire, and when you open it again, it ejects the spent cartridge, and a new one pops in place. So that allows a pretty rapid rate of fire. And you see the cartridge looks like a big pistol cartridge, because that's essentially what it is. But it's a powerful weapon. Many of these were converted into buffalo rifles after the war. I saw two the museum acquired yesterday that just come in. They're beautiful old Spencers that have set triggers. They have both a front and a secondary trigger. And they're clearly, they're marked with a well-known gunsmith in Denver who remanufactured them into buffalo guns.
So they were shortened then?
They actually re-barreled long.
Oh, they were?
Yeah, see, you lose accuracy with a short barrel, but they became longer range. I'm going to skip this slide for now.
Did the bullets compress when they went in, or did they stay just in the shape?
What do you mean when they hit tissue, flesh? Yeah, they expand. A soft lead bullet is a very nasty projectile. It expands, it tumbles, it may hit a bone and fragment off in different directions. Modern hunting ammunition is designed to do that at a very predictable rate of expansion. Just a lead slug is soft and fragile and very deadly. Not much range. These effective range would be 100 yards. Okay, there's a club with a point on it. And Punk refers constantly to the success of hand-to-hand fighting, not so much with swords, but pretty much with clubs, and to some extent sabers. Okay. Oh, look See this?
Yeah.
There's an iron blade or a stone blade embedded in a pretty long club.
Yeah.
At close range combat. It's only very recently that the Army dropped having bayonet lugs on the fronts of the rifles. And it's actually a pretty recent development. Because you get down, you're out of ammunition, you can swing it as a club, or maybe you can use it as a spear. Aren't we a wonderful species? That's probably pretty typical of a horse club. It's a real whippy handle with about a 2-pound rock on the end. And think of how a polo mallet is swung around. There's a lot of velocity on the end of something like that. Okay. Now, bows and pointed arrows, these are asymmetrical bows. If you look at them, it's not because of the angle of the photograph. This one that we have in our teaching kit is, it's a mock-up that we use. It could be asymmetrical, which means it may have a slightly longer end and a slightly shorter end. Because your hand is in the middle, it may affect the aim of the bow. So you may want to have it slightly more powerful on one end than the other to be better balanced, is what I think the theory is. Again, the bow making, arrow making technology is remarkable. To be able to straighten the shaft, glue, these people knew how to use glues and sinew lashings. Oftentimes an arrowhead is both glued and lashed in. These arrowheads are made out of sheet metal. And they were important trade goods, because they don't break. Okay?
Nice and light too. Very
Yeah.
stone.
And also, something about an arrow is they're hard to remove. When you take an arrow, even if it's an extremity, it's a pretty serious wound. And they also sever arteries and veins as they go in. A bullet blasts them to pieces, but an arrow is essentially a traveling knife. Okay. All right, now, how many of us are English descended here?
No connection yet.
And you must have some English somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. So who was King Harold?
No, no. Oh.
Harold was a Saxon king.
Saxon.
Harold,
The southern
give me the
Germany.
next slide, please. And then go back, please. He took an arrow to the eye at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And at that point, the Saxon army began to fall apart. The leadership was gone. The Normans launched enormous showers of arrows. Norman archers learned the tactic of shooting a high parabola, and the arrows coming down on top of people rather than straight at them. You get somewhat of a better range, but also, if you're looking up at the wrong time, it's really not good for your political future. So I just thought I'd put that in because he was killed by an iron-tipped arrow. Okay. All right. One more. All right. Now, here we have the Indian stuff. Most of it is either made locally by the tribes or traded for. And it is pretty good gunsmiths. Something they learned very early on, if they didn't have lead. Carefully worked rock makes a pretty good projectile, or a series of rocks in a gun. People are very clever, and when a piece of technology comes in, other people are going to elaborate it. Something that seems to be simple becomes something else. That's part of what this enormous thing up here does. You know, if there's anything which is probably against our survival, it's our giant brains. We're probably too smart for our own good in some ways. But here you see the typical weapons, which are essentially poking weapons, as well as a musket of some kind. Okay. And now look at the diversity of arrows. This one is a bird blunt. You don't want to spear or shoot an arrow right through your little partridge. You want to knock the partridge down. You want to bruise it and then go get it. Now look at the diversity of arrows. I don't remember whose collection this is. All kinds of ways of killing at a distance.
Feathers largely from what particular varieties of birds or whatever they could find.
Yeah, modern hunters still use bird blunts, but it may just be a shaft that's just simply sawed off on the end, or it may have a broader tip like this one does, and this one down here. I don't know a lot about archery, I know what the term is for it. But I thought this would be interesting to show the diversity and why are arrows feathered?
Yeah, it stays back.
Otherwise, they're more likely to tumble. Also, something that Indian people learned to do is they learned to put the feathers on at a spiral. They learned to rifle arrows. When an object spins as it travels, the gyroscopic forces tend to stabilize it. And I think trial and error, people, when somebody observes something, it tends to get picked up and copied and elaborated. All right, back to this illustration. It was very close hand-to-hand combat. There were military mistakes made. I'm not going to go through a military analysis on this, but you can go. There's plenty of stuff online and plenty of good books, and a lot of the papers I gave you they're very good descriptions of the battle. They're descriptions of the objects and the relative armaments. So I'm kind of just skipping over the top of it. But it was close. This is the second worst defeat of the U.S. Army by Indians. Custer was the worst.
Where was this at?
This is northeast Wyoming. The Army was, try this, John Bozeman put an illegal road right through treaty hunting country. The Indians had several treaties which guaranteed essentially northern Wyoming to Canada as hunting country for several different peoples. And John Bozeman drove a road through it because it took 30 days off of getting to the gold mines of Virginia City. So the government ends up building 3 illegal forts to defend an illegal road. And the forts all were destroyed within a few years. And there were several serious fights. The Fetterman was the worst. It was 91, or 81 killed. Custer was 215 or something like that. But they're famous for it because supposedly Invincible Army gets taken down. They're famous fights. While we're on the subject of all this weaponry, when the Fetterman happened, and the Army got the message to quit issuing Civil War junk and to go for modern weapons. So here you have, most you can see, these are trapdoor. The caliber is 4570, which will take down any North American game. Long range. So you can quickly load, close, fire, load, eject, or eject, load again. It's a good, simple, cheap, reliable system. And we do have one important rifle here that's historically and mechanically important. This is called a Springfield trapdoor, called the Allen conversion. One more slide, if you would. Let's go one more slide. And another. Yeah, I'm not getting anywhere. So here you have your musket you saw at the end of the table. Well, they had hundreds of thousands of these left at the end of the Civil War. And instead of junking them, they were dismantled, and the rear of the barrel was machined off. And then this new mechanism was put on the back. So the gun, instead of being a muzzle loader, now becomes a breech loader with modern metallic ammunition. So the rate of fire you get on this is like around 10 to 15 per minute with a very powerful long-range weapon. Another advantage of fixed ammunition is it's mostly waterproof. If you have a paper cartridge, moisture is going to interfere with its ignition. But a metallic cartridge dipped in paraffin is going to be pretty durable. So this is one of 6,000 of the earliest Allen made. If you know anything about or collecting, usually this is a straight line on the later models. The early models have this kind of pitch or angle in it. And they're quite valuable if you happen to come across one. Also, most of them had 3 bands holding together. This one had 2. It reflects some kind of modification somebody made, which makes it rare and expensive, so the owner tells me. So I'll have to believe the owner. Okay, Sabers and Swords. They were pretty effective. There's a mention that I think it was Fetterman decapitated an Indian with a sword. I don't know. I can see a fatal wound, but it's actually cutting completely through the cordage and bone of the neck. I'm not sure about that. Let's go on, another slide. There's the Henry rifle, so we've been through that. Let's go slide. And the Spencer. Go ahead. Keep going. Okay, now there's a Percussion Revolver, which is, it's great to have 6 shots in a row, but it sure is tough to load them. In the Civil War, many people often carry several revolvers, or they carry several loaded cylinders. And in a pause, they would actually just mount the cylinder, a spent cylinder, put a new one in that was loaded. you get a little bit of repeating fire. But, go ahead. Percussion revolver. Go ahead. Now we're getting a little more modern. And one more. Okay, that's where we want to be. This is the Colt, 1872 or 73 Colt. This is a replica. I could never afford one like this. This is probably $200 used gun. It shoots 45 caliber cartridges. This is the one you see in the movies all the time. The one that you load 6 and fire 30. They have this sort of magical effect. But anyway, they can be breech loaded. They load metallic cartridges. They could be done under combat conditions, and it's a powerful cartridge.
David, Crazy Horse carried in the story, he carried a pistol. I'm not sure where he got it from, but he used that several times, and he could figure out everything that was going on with it. And he also had the ability to look and see what those soldiers or those band players, what kind of guns they carried, and figured out that, wow, this is one that could repeat several times. I'm just curious where he might have gotten that.
I don't think he had a cartridge Colt. This hadn't been invented yet in 1866.
Okay.
I think he has a percussion Colt. There's something in the story about how he acquires that and his surrounding advisors learn how to load it and prime it. But you know, any whiskey trader is going to teach people how to use guns. In fact, one of the big, it's not so much in this book, but in reality, the spread of troubles among the Indians and also the spread of technologies due to whiskey trading, particularly out of Fort Benton. It's just god awful how whiskey was used. People would give up their entire herd of horses, their most valuable thing. The whiskey was made of alcohol and pepper and other good nutrients all at once, but the whiskey trading is a serious issue. But also it shows the exchange of cultures. We learn very, very quickly from each other. Some of us, a little like me, a little older, I'm a little slower on the technology. My son has to come over and rescue me every so often when I'm stuck. Here's Fort Phil Kearny, and when the book starts out, they're building this. It's huge. The foundations, Indians burned it down shortly after the fight. Among other forts that burned down in the next several years, but the foundations have been dug up. Something important. Remember, Indians don't build forts. They're highly mobile. They're guerrilla warfare people. They hit and run. When you're outgunned and undermanned, you do what you can. I was listening to a thing on NPR the other day about young women in the Warsaw Ghetto who fought the Nazi army to a standstill before they themselves were massacred. They actually expected to die, but they still stopped the German army for, I think it was for at least 3 weeks. The sacking of the Warsaw Ghetto. When people, I think rather bleakly, as a matter of fact, about the situation in Ukraine right now. That if that breaks loose, you'll have a real bloodbath in so many ways, and part of which will be a really huge guerrilla warfare. The Vietnam War was essentially a guerrilla war. There were very few standing pitched battles, nose-to-nose battles. So when you don't have it one way, you get it another way. So, but we tended to, especially after the Civil War, to build these big fixed forts. Lots of housing and big walls, and see how they built the fort to be able to absorb water from the stream? Yeah. You need that for yourself and for your livestock. The thing is, they built the fort miles away from their wood source. And that's always been a mystery because there actually was a stream there. They could have built the fort and the wood source close together. So every day, wood cutting crews would go out. They weren't cutting firewood. What they're doing is they're cutting timber trees. And they had 2 steam-powered sawmills, and Bunkie refers to both those. So you have this gigantic fort. The other thing is, for some reason, the Army allowed dependent women and children to come along, and when this thing was originally staffed. So that put a real risk factor into it. When the battle was lost, apparently the survivors that hadn't fought yet that day in the fort, about 45 people, expected to be overwhelmed, expected the fort would fall, and who knew? And they had actually rigged the powder magazine so that if it was going to fall, that the women and children would herded into it, blown up, they wouldn't be taken captive. And that's historically correct from what I can tell from the 3 sources that I read. Okay, the slide. All right, so-called wagon gun. Buck refers to the wagon gun, the Indians refer to the wagon gun. This is what's called a 12-pound howitzer. These were used widely in the West. 6 were issued to the government of Virginia City, Montana. One still survives there. The one that's underneath a staircase in the courthouse in Virginia City. But this thing back here, the horses are up this end out here. This is full of ammunition and powder, and the drivers sit on it. And then this is sort of the trailer. The gun is kind of the trailer. All right, so go a slide, please. Make more sense now?
Yep.
Range maybe about 1,200 yards, which is pretty considerable. Okay, let's go. Now, I'm going to momentarily debate. This is a bigger version of the 12. This is a 12-pound gun, Civil War gun, but it's a bigger carriage. It's something that I've never been able to determine from anything I've read is, did the Army actually have the little lightweight carriage, which eventually they did have, like you saw, or did they have one of these things surplus, which also had a longer range? The anomaly in the book is the Army put out painted rocks, I think it was every 300 yards away from the fort, so they could see where their range was. They went out to 1,200 yards, but go a slide now. And go another slide. Here's the kind of shell that would be fired. It's loaded. This is dying. Powder. This thing called a sabot, sort of like a piston to drive it out. And here's this shell, which is filled with large-sized lead balls, and it has explosives in it. Okay, go one more. Here's another version of it. And go one more. So the thing that's bothersome to me is this table. This shows the range of a mountain howitzer, that's a little one at first, is about 1,000 yards. And in the book, they refer to the last set of rocks being at about 1,250 yards. So and Punk's a real stickler for details. Ask him next week about it. But if they were going to reach 1,200 yards, they had to have been using a larger gun. It's one of those little points in history. Does it really matter? Probably not. But it's kind of interesting. The smaller gun probably couldn't shoot 1,000 yards, just barely. Probably couldn't shoot 1,200 yards. So I came across this table, and I just wondered about it. It's something I'd like to know more about. And here we go. We have one famous bugle. And go again. And this is the survivor of the battle. The men were totally dismembered. He goes into part of the legend that how you are at death is how you are in the afterlife. So if you're messed up pretty badly, that's how you go through your afterlife, is blind. If your ears have been poked out, you're deaf. If your limbs are cut off, you're crippled. I really don't know what the truth is of that belief, but that's sort of the legendary belief of it. The bugler was probably killed fairly early, and Punky actually has him killed kind of late, and using his bugle as his last weapon of resort. Okay? Now, here are the 2 wives of Carrington. They spent the rest of their lives trying to justify the battle, and that their dead husbands didn't completely follow up, and it should not be held in disgrace. Custer's wife did the same thing. She spent the rest of her life trying to defend his reputation. Okay? And that's probably the end of the slides. But what I'd like to do is call attention to your publications. How are we doing at time? We have 10 minutes? Aren't we over? Okay. So I've given you in your wad of stuff there. These are there are short films online of all the stuff that's on this. And it's worth learning to go online. And then these are relevant books to go on. I want to call your attention to one. I'm giving a copy to this library. All right, now we mentioned the matter of breech-loading weapons and reliability. Well, this is one of some of you know what the Marias Massacre was and what a stain it was on everybody's honor. This is called the Marias Massacre, and it started at Fort Ellis, Montana. In 1870, supposedly, some Blackfeet tribesmen had murdered some settlers, and therefore General Sherman, the General Sherman who sacked Georgia and the South, that Sherman, and President Grant wanted these Indians punished. Punished means massacre, that's kind of a euphemism for massacre. So at 40 below zero, about 250 men from Fort Ellis were sent north to roughly where Shodo is, that is, I think west of Great Falls, about 50 miles, on the Marias River. And they, despite many warnings by their scouts, they got the wrong village. They simply murdered, literally in cold blood, because of the terribly low temperature. They shot into teepees, they burnt teepees down. The village that they were attacking had smallpox in it. They were killing smallpox for other people. It's a ghastly, total screw up. And Mountain Chief, the one they're supposed to have gotten, was in the cabin about 14 miles away. And the Major Baker, who was the commander, was drunk throughout the whole thing. So on bad information and bad behavior and really brutal, bloody behavior, people that weren't murdered or chopped to death, speaking of hatchets, something that's mentioned repeatedly in this book is of soldiers killing Indian peoples with axes. It's repeatedly, it shows up and this is a wonderfully documented book. There's no nonsense about this book, it's just pretty tough to read. But people that did survive ran off into 30 and 40 below weather and probably died of exposure, or smallpox, or all of the above. So Sherman and company were kind of embarrassed by all this, so they covered it up. And the book is, the first 2/3 of the book are getting to the massacre. And then there's a few pages of massacre. And then the rest of the book is the cover-up. And all kinds of quotations and misappropriations of newspaper headlines. The documentation on the book is this thick. Documentation starts here, and it's really beautifully documented. Paul Wiley is an attorney, and he does his research. The book is pretty readable. There's a couple typos in it that I marked, but I've read this. I'm going to donate this to you guys tonight. But the soldiers, I'm coming back to this gun thing here, is they no longer were armed with inferior weapons. The probability is they were armed with this kind of Springfield. You don't think they're armed with Spencers. You think they're armed with these, which is even a more powerful weapon than this Springfield. This is a cavalry version. The history of this gun was bought about 1960 from an elderly Crow man. He says that he picked it up somewhere. I've checked the numbers on it. No, it's not a Custer gun. In Custer's battle, his men were armed with these. They were armed with breech loaders, Springfields like this, quick. One of the interesting thing about that is the cartridges weren't manufactured very well, so when they fire, the cartridge would stick, and the ejector on the gun didn't pull them out. In the middle of a battle, they're with their knives digging spent casings out of their guns.
Oh.
A few years ago, there was a fire at the battlefield, and then archaeology was done. They actually found locations where people fought their last fight. Found a lot of cartridge cases. They found many cases with knife damage to them where they've been sort of dug out. They were able to do modern ballistics on slugs that were found, and actually were able to trace individual bullets to individual guns that are known to survive. It's a remarkable piece of archaeology. So, Baker's men were armed with these, and these don't misfire even in cold weather. Many of these older kinds of guns would misfire when they're cold or wet. But it was a terrible slaughter, and nobody really took any responsibility for it. Several careers were enhanced, and Sherman managed to skate away from the whole thing. He got away with it, and the press, because the press coverage out here wasn't much. Okay, one last thing is about communication in the West. When Fort Phil Kearny was built, the nearest telegraph was Fort Laramie, which is 230 miles away. When Fetterman and his command were wiped out, Laramie had to be notified, so one man rode one horse in dead of winter, 230 miles in 4 days, and both barely lived, but he got into Laramie, and that's when the first reports came out about the Fetterman massacre. But it took 4 days. But something that was going very rapidly was telegraph building. Fort Ellis had a telegraph by 1870. And the fort was started in 1867. So the speed of the frontier, the speed of settlement, the speed of technology, and military conquest was very rapid. And the 20th century comes along, and we have essentially a militarized century. Look at the amount of talent and time and effort we put into revising weapon systems. If you want something really eerie to do, is go to the Air Force Museum at Malmstrom Air Force Base. It has a missile silo you can go down into.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It's not a live Minuteman, but it's there. And it gives you a real sense of what's there. And on the tip of the Malmstrom missiles are 3 warheads, so each warhead equals 3 dead cities if they ever go off. I'm going to speak personally covering my museum badge at this point. I am very concerned about world conditions now. Sounds almost like August of 1914, where armies are moving around, and then somebody gets to be a hothead and sets it off. You know, an assassination was set off in 1914. I'm very concerned about it, that a huge land war, incredible waste in every sense of the words, may break out. I have no idea what kind of diplomacy can head it off.
Yeah, they're scared of that right now, yeah.
I mean, what do you do when somebody's trying to expand their borders? Catherine the Great of Russia was asked, what is your protection? How do you protect your borders? She says, I constantly expand them. Ukraine has been invaded for the last 300 years. I think it's a favorite hobby of the Russians. Don't know what that is. So can I pick up quick questions? I'm sorry I'm sort of stumbling on this. I'm kind of tired, and I think I'm actually over-prepared on this. Sure.
On the battle in Wyoming, did they do like the battle of Custer's Last Stand, where the Indians took their clothes and guns and weapons and knives and went and hid them somewhere?
Doesn't seem to be. It seems that, well, for one thing, the Indians picked up a lot of revolvers. Yeah, they captured 30 Spencers. They captured ammunition for Spencers. The Indians at the Bighorn had Henry rifles. They traded for them. They certainly knew what they were. They had some Spencers. They had quite a few breech-loading rifles. They certainly had plenty of muskets and a lot of arrows. And one thing is a shower of arrows is probably. I think we trivialize it. I don't think we should trivialize it. It's an enormously effective local weapon. I think when we get down to guerrilla warfare, probably a quiet arrow is better than a gunshot.
I would assume that when they have their shields and all this stuff and arrows, they shoot the arrows in the air and come down. Well, everybody put their shields up. Now they're exposed here.
So you're thinking strategic,
So,
right?
Yeah.
An observant officer would do that.
Yeah.
And so the thing that you have to, Red Cloud and the other chiefs studied the Army for some years. They studied maneuvers, and they also developed they used a trap. They used some of their own people as bait, and to lead part of Fetterman's command out of sight. And then 2,000 people have been sleeping been hiding in cold ground overnight. Remember, this is December 21st, folks. They rose up at the same moment, and wham, that was over. The guys, the 2 traders that had Henry rifles, were somewhat isolated, and they made their own last stand. So the Indians acquired 2 Henry rifles in there too. So that's something about warfare, is you acquire materiel. That's what those women did in the Warsaw Ghetto. They'd acquired German weapons. They murdered people for German weapons to murder Germans. Not surprising in the situation in the ghetto.
So Europeans fighting against arrows wore like chainmail and protection. The cavalry, the U.S. never did have any defensive protection.
Body
against
armor
that.
is actually pretty recent. During World War II, air crews wore kind of flak suits at high altitude, sort of. But armor is heavy and is expensive. Slows down your movements. Most people just want to be able to move very rapidly, flexibly, and sort of take their chances. I think being a soldier, you probably get into kind of a fatalistic frame of mind. Most novelists kind of write them that way. I think the very best war novel, there's two war novels I recommend. One is The Red Badge of Courage. Absolutely, Stephen Green got it right. And the other was Jones's Thin Red Line. Those are the 2 I'd recommend for true, honest books about warfare. Going online, I gave you the list of stuff to look up online. You can have fun. There's lists of relative who had what when. You're welcome to reprint and share this stuff. You can take some extras with you, since obviously I overprinted here. And you do have you have an approximation of a battle map. You know, it's only a half day's drive to the Fetterman site. And you drive part of the old Roseland Trail. I think it's a worthwhile trip, just, it's beautiful. And, but it's also very moving when you're there about two great civilizations clashing. So, anything else I can do besides handing you museum brochures and urge you to get memberships? Get memberships.
I was looking this afternoon, and the author grew up in Wyoming.
Yes, and he lives in Missoula now.
And
He's coming here next week.
And he used to serve when he was in high school, like these guys back here. He worked at Living History at Fort Laramie.
Small world, my youngest cousin was actually on his gun crew at Fort Laramie. He also was a reenactor on that. Something, by the way, when you see a cannon fired during reenaction, it goes puff, a little flame. When a cannon loaded with 6 pounds of powder goes off, the recoil. I restored 2 Civil War cannons, and I had to find the trail stock on a cannon is a piece of oak. It's 9 inches by 9 inches by 9 feet, and the one I just did for the Poplar Museum was actually a gun used against the Indians and left behind by the Army. Who knew? But anyways, sorry, I'm not going to go into it. But I had to find a 9 by 9 by 9 because if anybody ever uses the gun, it has to have that kind of strength, or it'll break its carriage on recoil. These are high-powered weapons. An ordnance rifle is accurate to 1 yard at 5,000 yards, and this is a Civil War gun. And during the Civil War, armaments matured from just being muzzle loading, sort of buckets full of gunpowder, to being very precise. And ordnance rifle is not made of steel; it's made of wrought iron. 400 bands of iron welded together in a huge press, and none of these guns ever burst in combat. Most gun crews were killed, or not most, but often gun crews were killed by their own guns blowing up, because they were just castings, especially the Confederate guns, which were cast under really dire conditions, where they couldn't really deal with the metallurgy.
I've seen sketches of cannons like that, where they actually tied the wheels down with ropes.
You've seen the one in my office. You've seen the one in my office, right? No. You've seen that one? It's a 12-inch gun that blew the muzzle off and just kept using the gun afterwards. Okay, anything else?
Yeah, the way he portrayed Jim Bridger in the story, I was just curious what your thoughts were about that. And the other one was Crazy Horse's, I want to call him.
He had sort of a shaman in there.
Yeah.
There's truth to that. Yes, there were spiritual advisors on this too, that seemed to have second sight. It's probably that they were thinking. I think second sight usually comes from very careful analytical thinking. You can actually think far enough ahead, like for instance the mess in Ukraine right now. You can actually think forward to what its possibilities are, and maybe think of a way of neutralizing it. But I think the book. I'm pretty fussy about books, but I really admire the book for his care and accuracy. And he draws his characters, the conflict of insubordination among the officers. It's historically right. That's what the 2 women were trying to disavow. They never could change the truth of it. But we're human beings. We're caught in combat situations. We're not going to be too noble in that. I know my own self well enough that I would not do well.
What about Jim Bridger?
Jim Bridger, from what I know of him, I think the portrayal is pretty accurate. Bridger was a very practical man. He had also a phenomenal memory, and that's why he could go throughout the West. He knew the landmarks. And we just got something at the museum the other day, which is really terrific. It just came in. We have a dead high altitude juniper that has a ram's horn grown into it.
Oh.
What it is, it was a marker for Shoshone. Shoshone used to mark their trails out here by by nailing or pegging a ram's horn into a living tree. Well, this tree lived so long it actually absorbed the ram's horn. And we actually have that.
I have a picture of it if anybody wants to see.
Wow.
With you?
Yeah, on my phone.
Get your phone out. Why are you sitting?
I'll do it after you.
What about his companion, Beck Rose?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Crow, that he calls himself a Crow chief.
Yeah.
I don't know.
He was very flamboyant. He was that was an
African
interesting
American.
character.
The these things are really confusing. We're having a huge crow exhibit this summer at the museum, and we're working through all kinds of ethnic stuff so we get it right. And I think we have 3 curators coming from the tribes. The crow, they learned to adapt to whites pretty early. For instance, they traded buffalo hides for canvas. They were among the first of the tribes who generally make their teepees out of canvas, which is much lighter. Not as durable as hide, but it's much easier to handle. Most of the other tribes, they mentioned in the book too, stayed with skin teepees for quite some time, but eventually there were no skins to stay with. People had to adapt over to muslin or cotton stuff. Just out of curiosity, what would you like for future programs? What should, at the museum, we try to plan ahead, what you might want to see there, not just in exhibits, but also night programs.
Civil War.
Yeah, Montana was involved in it, no doubt about it. We have a Civil War cannon on display.
My great grandfather was in the Civil War, 103rd Infantry in Pennsylvania.
With records
He was
of the,
captured and he was in a prison.
was he in Andersonville, or where was he?
I'm not sure. He was put there.
This March, if you're interested, we might have a guest lecturer come and talk about flint knapping, about how they would flint the chert in obsidian for arrowheads, and just talk about those tools. Seems pretty relevant to this conversation.
Did you find the picture?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna wait for this to be over, so you can just come in.
What else can we do? Close her up, and we'll start packing all this junk up. It's all these valuable items up.
Well, thank you for
Come again, as we say.
One Book Belgrade continues next week. It comes to our final presentation by author Michael Funk. Be sure to come check it out. Like I said earlier, if you are entering in to the winter reading program, make sure you sign that sheet on your way out. And please help yourself to any of the snacks and refreshments. I have an office full of them. So, but thank you all for coming out.
I just started that.
My background, I was reading Marias Massacre,
Why, wait until I had to do something pretty fast.